Hi, and welcome to part 3 of Revelations 20. In my last two videos, the first one we talked about the principle of 1 through 4 where Satan is bound, put in a prison. It's not his authority to bound, but him himself that is being bound by being put into a prison where he's not able to run around freely deceiving the nations. Very literal. In the second video, in the last one we talked about, is we went back to Zechariah in 12 and 14, and I encourage you to go back and read that, well, along with 19 and 20, and kind of start harmonizing the two of them together and see how you can't have a siege in one day and then the inhabitants being protected, and that Jerusalem will exist and be there, and that Christ, when he returns, it will be to Jerusalem. His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. All this language is second coming language. And so once that established, then we must harmonize those events that is being described in there with the day of his coming, which is Revelations 19. Now, in partial apologetica, what I'm dealing with here is an answer against Amill and the Post Mill position that take that Revelations 20 is a recap. And so what I want to point out here is why it is impossible for it to be a recap. And the first important point is to remember that Christ is the one who is ruling on earth during the millennium. It has nothing to do with the saints ruling with him in heavens over the heavenly places. His feet stand on the Mount of Olives. He comes and is there. Revelations 20, the camp of the saints. Remember when he promised to resurrect that he brought him with us and that we would dwell with him and be with him forever. And this is a physical face-to-face type of presence that we're talking about. He is present now with his saints, ruling from Jerusalem after his coming. So in the Amill position, they spiritualized that 1,000 years and they believe it began in 33. So we disproved that it cannot begin in 33 because Satan is not deceived. He's still running around. We're going to deal with 4 through 6 here in just a moment. But Post Mill also claims that this is a recap of 19 from a different perspective. So the mill also starts and is the church age. They both agree to the same thing. But we're going to go a different direction here in our understanding. And so let's start by looking at something here. Then I saw thrones and seated on them to whom the authority to judge was committed. And also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God. Now we've talked about this in another video. And so it is worth repeating and worth you and listening, grabbing some of this stuff. I saw the beginning of those who worshiped the beast and the image and received its mark in the forehead of their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Okay, see, it's a limited perfect time that the saints are reigning with him after they have came to life. How do dead people who have been beheaded come back to life? Resurrection. In fact, he says what? This is the first resurrection. I'll get more to that in a second. So, what I want to stress here is that chronology of what's going on. And now I've checked with other scholars and I've talked with, I'm not saying I'm talking, but I've read their works about the arguments against the recap theory and why they say it is recapped. For instance, the war is supposed to be a Greek construct that refers to Revelation 6 and 19 as all being part of the war, the battles, that all three of these battles are supposed to be the exact same thing. I would agree that 6 and 19 are basically the same thing, but when we come to 20, this battle that described here is different. And it's for these differences that I'm bringing out in the chronology that demonstrate that. And the first one being is that Satan being bound and put in prison is the first distinctive mark that begins this millennial period. So it cannot begin until that happens. And it also begins with the beast and the false prophet who are thrown into the lake of fire. But I'll get on that a little bit more and talk about that. But in the basic chronology of 20, we have Satan who is in prison. Christ rules from Jerusalem with the saints, and we talked about that from Zechariah 14. He rules from Jerusalem, and they come up year to year with him. At the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is released from this prison. He gathers an army. At the end of this, army, when it gathers and surrounds Jerusalem, again, of course, it never describes Jerusalem being sacked or sieged or anything else. It says they gather against him. But fire comes down and devours the army of the ungodly. Okay, predators, let's think about this for a second. The Roman army comes against Jerusalem in 70 AD, but fire comes down and devours the army of the ungodly. Do you not see the contradiction of that? That is impossible for that to be in 70 AD because no fire came down. The army of the Romans were not destroyed whatsoever. They left with their prisoners and went back to Rome victorious. So there's no sense in which they were defeated or fire came down or anything else like that. That's an impossibility. You're just creating a contradiction. But this is also the point, the distinction of why it's not a recap, because when Jesus returns, he sets up his kingdom there in Jerusalem, and the people of the nations who have survived that came against it will come year after year to Jerusalem. Sorry, folks, that didn't happen in 70 AD. Jerusalem was completely destroyed, and you have no picture of anybody coming to Jerusalem afterwards to worship the king and to keep the Feast of Booths. All that stuff ended in 70 AD. Sorry. And you can't tell me that's spiritual either. That's just kind of bogus. And I've heard so many explanations that this was fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes and everything else. But again, in order to come to those conclusions, you have to over-spiritualize these things and say that Christ is in heaven ruling. You know, the saints are ruling with him in heaven. Had nothing to do with down here. And that's just exegetically unprovable. Now, again, I'm going to restate here. Revelation 20 says, I saw the souls who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus. Now, these people had not worshipped the beast or its image and not received its mark on their foreheads and their hands. They were killed for naught. And what does it say? They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Here's the resurrection. This is the first resurrection. So, dispensationalists, we have to throw out the idea that there is a pre-trib rapture or resurrection of the saints, because it includes the people who were killed during the tribulation. That would be the first resurrection. You cannot have two resurrections of the saints, one at the beginning and one at the end. I'm sorry. The Bible never teaches two resurrections of the just. There's only one. And I've heard all the arguments. And trust me, the arguments are completely bogus, because you have to stretch things, literally stretch it to beyond comprehension to get one that happens before and one after. And the most common logical thing is how stupid can we be that if Christ was to return in an instant when we're not aware of, in a pre-trib rapture, and all of a sudden everybody's gone, the whole world is going to sit there and go, okay, mark it, 7 years from this point, he's coming back again. I can fool around, play around, do whatever, take, all of these other things. But hey, come 70 AD, man, or not 70 AD, obviously, whenever he does come back in 7 years from now, I'll just get my life right with the Lord, because I know he's coming in this. And, I'll be on the right side of things. Yes. And forewarning, what? He comes like a thief. No one will know. So if you have a rapture 7 years before, and then 7 years later, or 3.5 years later, whatever you take on that, he's coming again to earth to rule and reign, then you know the date and the time. Sorry, you can't do that. But the point, of course, is those that died during the tribulation are the ones that are raised in this first resurrection. So this forces the first resurrection to happen after the tribulation, not before it. Dispensationalism, pre-trib view is out the door. Now, these people come to life, of course. They are resurrected into their bodies to rule with Christ. So that's why we talk about the physical resurrection. What is the point of people being physically, bodily raised if they're just going to go to heaven again and that's it? And how is that vindication before the world? I mean, here's the beast who's been making war on the saints, killing them by the hundreds of thousands, to the point where we see from all nations thousands and thousands of people standing before the throne and saying, "How, Lord," before we are vindicated in our vengeance. And I can't think of a sweeter point of revenge and of vindication that when Christ comes down, we, as a made immortal and imperishable, come with him as his army, and we fight against those people who have come against Jerusalem. And a side note, do you know that they gather in the Valley of Megiddo, this battle that takes place? It's not a siege against Jerusalem in Revelation. It describes in the Valley of Megiddo, which is hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem, not a ton of million miles, but far enough away that you can't say that they're besieging Jerusalem in a valley that's quite a distance away. Sorry, it doesn't work. But that is where the armies gather. That is where Christ returns with his army and defeats the army of the beast. Had to throw that out there. The Valley of Megiddo is not Jerusalem. So when he returns, he appears and he's going to return over Jerusalem. These people coming to life then on earth are not going back into heaven to live in heaven. They don't need bodies in heaven per se. That's not the whole purpose of us being resurrected. We are coming back to life, which is death to life. We are coming back to life, and that resurrection is to rule with him in our vindication and vengeance. So when people see the people that they have killed by beheading him because they didn't take the mark, these are the ones who are coming back and fighting on his side against him. And we stand up in victory over these beast armies. Wow, what a vindication that they killed us, but here we come back and have killed them. Does that theme sound a little bit familiar? Think about it. They killed Christ on the cross, but he returned in vindication in 70 with the Roman army that destroyed Jerusalem and the people that crucified Christ and put him on the cross. So here we're talking about vindication of Christ. It will be the same for us in that last days. Our vindication and vengeance against those armies that did that. So the Amill position basically denies this physical reign on earth during the mill when he appears a second time. Now think about that. Philippians 3:21, that whole passage, he will appear a second time to bring salvation, which is the redemption of the bodies. That resurrection is the redemption of our bodies, where we are raised immortal and imperishable, and we cannot be killed in the battle. So the victory over our enemies is absolutely complete. There's, no loss of life on God's army side. And so we are going to be physically reigning and ruling with him. Now, I can go into all kinds of speculation exactly how that means to rule over the nations, but I get the idea of like ambassadorship, that we are going to be quite involved in what happens in the nations of the world. Personally, myself, if I had to be killed during this whole millennial tribulation period, I'm going through it, I get killed and everything else, and the suffering that I've gone through in this earth and never had anything, I would absolutely look forward to a mill period where I get to build my little villa on the Caribbean, where God is restoring life and the things, and I get to sit back and drink, not cocktails, I don't drink alcohol whatsoever, but to have some nice lemonade, to sit on the beach and go fishing all day long and doing all those things where I don't have to work anymore to survive. I eat because I've got a new body. I eat out of the enjoyment and doing all those things where I get to live on a pretty sweet earth, that God is going to restore and be a part of that restoration process for that 1,000 years. Hey, I'm looking forward to sitting back on a beach. Maybe that's not true, but I sure would love to be able to enjoy something like that. Okay, enough with that. So the predator's problem, of course, is that in Revelation 20, Jerusalem is called the camp of the saints, the home of the army. And when you look at that, the camp of the saints, that camp has the idea from the Greek of this is a barracks. This is where an army dwells and lives with that. Well, okay, so rule out the Caribbean island, right? The saints return are going to be ruling and living in Jerusalem. This is why the second army gathers against Jerusalem, because that's where the camps and that's where Jesus is living. When Satan is released, he goes back and deceives the nations. And they come and they attack. But here's the problem, of course. In 70, Jerusalem was not the camp of the saints because all the Christians fled to Pella. And secondly, it was not the city he loves. According to preterists, Jerusalem was the harlot, the Babylon. And if that is true, then why is it in Revelations 20, if this is a recap, he's calling this the camp of the saints, the city he loves? See, those two paradigms do not match. You can't have it being called the Babylon, the whore, and then at the same time in a recap saying it's the city he loves. I'm sorry, that does not work. And how much more can you say about something like that in such a strange economy? When I attended the Blue Point Bible Conference and did my debate with Michael Miano, who I was very nice to and very gentle with, and did not go after him per se, because I did not want to come off as a cutthroat, kind of mean, antagonistic person. My point was to win them over, to have them start to listen, to plant seeds for people to start listening and thinking. And basically, I went into a den of evil spirits there, and I hate to say it that way, but afterwards, the venom that came back just revealed the real truth and the real heart of preterism against people who speak and speak words of life against them. They have to speak evil. And totally torn to shreds and all of that because of my niceness and generosity. But trust me, right now, I am open to any other debate with John Watson, William Bell, Don Preston, anybody else who wants to actually debate. And at this point, I'm about ready and willing to come to where they are and do it, and deal with those things face to face if they want to do that. And at this point, I'm sorry, I'd have to rip that whole preterist paradigm to shreds in moments. It won't take much for me to do it at this point again, and it'd be no holds bar, no mercy. I will cut the throat of anybody who wants to argue for preterism in a one-on-one debate at this point. I will show up their inconsistencies so badly, so quickly, it'll make some people's head spins. And some of those I have brought up here. And so by me stating this, yes, I am open for a debate, public debate in front, and to deal with things. So I'm going to wrap it up here at this point, getting on through 17 minutes here before. I will come back and follow up with verses 7 through 10. But just the recap, of course, and the idea is that Satan is actually in prison. Christ rules from Jerusalem with the saints, based on Zechariah 12 and 14. The 1,000 years, Satan is released. He gathers an army. And at the end of this, the fire comes down and devours the army of the ungodly. That will be what we'll get into in part 1, 2, 3. This is 3 in part 4. So thank you for watching. And if there's people that you know that has questions about eschatology and things, direct them over here. And just presenting a different view for you guys to interact with and to think about. And I hope I'm bringing up enough points here for people to sit there and say, there's something we have more to look at, instead of just embracing it. So thank you again. You guys have a good night. We'll see you later.